In this Pixiv Drawfest 3 workshop, we'll be going through the topic of how to draw cool female characters using dramatic lighting. So normally, a lot of times I find that dramatic lighting can be hard to approach because sometimes when we want to draw a character and we struggle with some of the details and some of the design, after all, there are so many parts to drawing. So naturally, sometimes lighting feels like this extra thing that you do not want to think too much about. However, one of the most fun experiences I have is whenever I draw a scene or a character with really interesting lighting effects or different lighting angles, right, to bring out a specific mood or a specific sort of feeling from the viewer. So hopefully in this workshop, I will be able to share with you how I do this and explain to you some of the simple things that you can try out for yourself to really just have fun and explore more different lighting alternatives and add a bit more spice to your own work as well. So let us begin. So here are some examples of my own work in which I used some dramatic lighting effects. So the idea behind a lot of these is to use light in a way that it reveals part of the character in an interesting way, or it highlights the silhouette of the character, and also to sort of emphasize the physical setting the character is in as well. So I feel like this sort of method really helps not only to just make the image look more interesting at first glance, but also to help create a more sort of almost immersive situation or in a way construct a full scene just by using lighting as well. So this is what we will mainly be talking about in this video, and let us move on to the tutorial outline. There are two parts to this overall workshop. Part A is this video and talking about how we sort of basically just go about the process of creating the characters like in these examples, right? How do we draw the sketch of the character, and then how do we apply the lighting step by step? So this is mainly today's workshop and part A of this overall process, right? And part B, we'll talk more about it later, but it's basically something that you can follow along yourself as well. So in part A, I think the process can be broken down into two main pieces, right? And one is designing cool characters. So it helps a lot that sometimes as you go into drawing the piece with dramatic lighting and all that you have like an interesting character design to start from. So this is sort of the base of the situation, right, where you begin with, and then after that, we can talk about applying special lighting, which is right the process of adding on this dramatic lighting setup, how to make things look organized, but also look really interesting, and so on and so forth, right? So from these, we also break it down a bit more. For example, using references and then adding your own preference, right? That's how you kind of like design and then or at least create a draft of a design of a character that you find interesting. And then after that, you can choose a lighting plan, right? Do you want the light to come from the left, from the right, from below, right? So that is sort of kind of like the decision process, and then finally applying the lighting accurately. So moving on to designing cool characters. As you can see here, I have a whole bunch of references that I pulled up. And for the purposes of this sort of short tutorial, I'll keep it a bit simpler, right? So a lot of times, I think a lot of excellent character designs come from a lot of good real-world references. They're oftentimes assembled from a variety of sources, from perhaps even crossing time periods or entire fashion styles, right? So you can sort of look at what makes a design interesting to you, pick out various parts of it that you find super attractive or super appealing or interesting just in general, and then combine and mix them up, and then basically just add your own preference, right? So this is sort of the concept that I feel like is really central to designing really any kind of character, having like a good basis in reality, but you want to add in your own preference and then make your own sort of style be felt as well. So in this process, I would definitely encourage everyone to try your best in designing your own character, have fun thinking about what you feel is cool, because after all, the whole point of The workshop is to help you have fun drawing your own characters using cool lighting as well. So I'm not going to elaborate too much about like a full design process for the purposes of this video, but I definitely am looking forward to seeing everyone explore their own ideal cool character. So once we have our basic character design in mind, another thing to plan for before we begin drawing is choosing a lighting plan to go for. So here are some examples just to really demonstrate the variety of plans that you can choose. For example, the light comes from behind, the point of view. The light comes from in front of the point of view, but behind the character they were looking at, and in multiple directions. Or the lighting can come from above, but obscure a substantial portion of the character, right? Because it's not from above and in front, it's from straight above. So you still have plenty of shadows and, sort of these moody kind of dark areas to work with as well. Or we can also have sort of the lighting sandwich the character from in front and behind in two sort of angles. And then we can create this effect as well. So this is just some examples, and feel free to sort of choose your own lighting plan later on as well, right? But this is just saying that in part of the process, choosing a plan is important. And then last but not least, right? We also need to apply things accurately. A lot of times we get really used to drawing a character with a simple lighting setup or a lighting setup that we're used to. And in that sense, it is probably useful to remind ourselves when we are doing a different lighting setup that we still need to respect the fundamentals and make sure, like, as we light different surfaces, we have to respect their actual volume, their actual shapes, and how the light works around them as well. So in this case, I think I did not too bad a job, right? Which is why I'm using this as an example. For example, I managed to sort of contain the sort of bluish light that comes from over here in a good way to make sure that it only hits the correct surfaces, as well as this secondary light coming from the right, to make sure it hits the relevant surfaces as well. Right, so this is kind of like example where the yellow areas are sort of where the bluish strong light comes from, right? Like all the areas that are relevant to it. And the green areas are where the secondary light comes from. So this is sort of the split that this sort of like a basic split of what we should be thinking about as we paint and as we proceed with the creation of the piece itself. So this is the basic breakdown done. And then now next we can talk about how to step-by-step create this painting, which is the example or demo piece that I prepared for this particular workshop this time. So yeah, without further ado, let's head to the process of creating this piece step by step. So the first step is almost always to begin with a line sketch. So the purpose of a line sketch is really quite simple. The idea is that you want to have something that is rough and adjustable, but can present a lot of information for how much work is needed to create it. So a line sketch is our best option in this case, right? Because we want to make sure to carry over and present the design that we want. In this case, I'm just choosing to draw a simple suit because it's sort of the most basic option for like a quote-unquote cool character. So that is the option that I've gone for. And because I'm drawing everything out with lines, I can make it look quite clear and quite clear-cut as well. At the same time, we can also figure out the pose, figure out sort of how the character will fill the frame, as well as think about the perspective and add in a bit more details here and there to sort of flesh out the feel of the pose and the character and the general scene as a whole. So that is sort of stage one, the line sketch. Moving on to the next step, this is the base values, which I've added here to the line sketch. So what I like to do is to have like a dark color, especially since right now we're talking about drawing like a character in shadow using dramatic lighting. I find that it's good to give the sort of background like a base gray, right? A base dark gray. So this is useful for generally lowering the brightness of the overall scene and kind of bringing it a bit closer to its sort of almost final stage. So it's a bit easier to read the drawing for yourself and make adjustments later on. So in the value stage or the base value stage, aside from the background, right, we want to capture the main value groups of our subject here as well. So we can split those into a couple of groups. For example, the hair and suit of the character is really dark, so you can split that into group 1 or group A. And then we can have the skin tone of the character in group B, and then the sort of white inner shirt of the character being group C. So these are the 3 main value groups, and the purpose of the base value stage is to separate them out. And the reason for doing this is because we know that these materials are really distinct in appearance. So we want them to have this strong relationship right from the onset before we add in any lighting, right? Because after we add lighting, we are going to sort of perceive the situation as a whole. So when we do that, we want to make sure that, for example, our light that hits our dark shirt, our dark suit coat here, is going to be reflected appropriately, right? Compared to, say, the light which hits this white collar, which will be really, really bright. So we want to make sure our impressions are on point once we proceed to the stage after these. So here is where things get slightly more complicated. This is where we start introducing multiple lights, right? Which is the theme of the tutorial, right? Introducing dramatic lights. But not to worry, we can do this in 3 simple stages. Stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. And these 3 steps are me working out what light I want, what direction they come from, and then drawing them in one at a time. So in step 1, I decided, okay, I want a strong light to come from behind the character from a certain angle. And so the entire step, right, is just dedicated to doing this. So as you can see here, compared to the base value stage, all I did was to add these white areas of light to the appropriate surfaces where the character's body and the character's sort of volume, the 3D structure of the character can receive the light. So this is really straightforward, but it does require you to be a bit careful and think about what areas receive what light. So for example, here I didn't realize earlier on that, for example, right, we can add actually a bit more light to the palm of the hand or the side of the hand here, right? Because this area here is exposed to the light as well, right? Can have almost a bit of light here and a bit of light here. So this is step 1, where we decide, okay, we want the backlight, and then we apply it in this way. So step 2 is where I decide to apply, okay, so we want to have the character in like a dark area, but we also want to have the feeling that the character is in like an open space. So usually to help do that, we want to give the idea that there's a high ceiling, right? Or infinitely high ceiling. So generally how we do that is to make sure like the top facing areas of the character, like for example, the top of the head, let me use a different color. For example, the top of the head, the part of the shoulders and the chest that is facing upwards, right? And the part of the waist that is contouring upwards as well. These areas, right, all receive a bit of light. So this creates the impression that, for example, in this situation, our character is sort of exposed to like an open sky or something, right? Because it's less sort of cramped and occluded as compared to from below, where it's in relative shadow. Okay, so this is my explanation for why we're using the top light. So how do we apply the top light is almost the same concept. We basically just want to look at our character. Again, in this case, we're going back to the base value stage because we're doing it step by step, right? So we've gone back to the base value stage and added sort of a light that comes from on top in this area, in this area, in this area, a little bit on the fingers, as well as this area. So these are the main areas of concern that we will be adding the light to. So once we're done with that, we can look at our next sort of light source, which is another side light that we want to come from this direction. So this is another pretty much the same process, right? But we have to, again, think of the character in 3D in order to figure this out. So sometimes what I also do find helpful is that, let's say we have some trouble visualizing, right? Okay, how should things look like if a light comes from this angle from a character? So in this situation, my personal recommendation is, as always, right, we want to look up some references of dramatic lighting. For example, if you recall in certain movies, or rather in a lot of movies when we have dark scenes, you'll notice how they do the lighting is to almost always, right, have this sort of small accent light from the side to reveal the characters a little bit and keep them mysterious. So, right, my recommendation is, if you have trouble, always look for reference, and then as you apply it, think about what kind of surfaces that the light is hitting and how to best depict them. But to put things shortly, or a bit more simply, we also figure out the surfaces where the light coming from the right will hit, and then we capture them as well. Right, so this is sort of the areas where a light coming from the right side will hit. And then once we have all three pieces of the puzzle, the backlight, the top light, which is a bit weak, as well as the side light, we can combine them into this piece here, or rather this stage here, right? As you can see, I said combine. And we can do this quite simply. And I will actually provide the Photoshop file for all these steps, so you can actually figure out how exactly it's done. So not to worry too much about the technical details, right? So now I just want to explain that once we have all these three things, we can combine them, and then we have this complete, almost complete sort of effect, right? We have the top light, we have the side light, and then we have the strong light that comes from behind the character. And then once we reach this stage, we have a good idea of what our character or what our scene or what our piece might look like. We can start adjusting the values using this very helpful curves tool as well, as you can find here, right, under curves. So this tool is really good because once we have the relationship between all our values, because once we have gone through these three stages, we have a good relationship between all our values. We can use the curves tool to adjust the values sort of as a group. So now we're done with this basic part, right? I applied the curves and played with it a little bit to achieve this next stage. So all I did from here to here is to use curves, darken the suit and the hair a bit to create a bit more sort of contrast in the local values. And we're at this stage. So at this point in time, I'm looking at the drawing and I'm thinking, okay, we're quite close to the exact values that we will be using for the final piece. We can start introducing color. And how I like to do color is also quite methodical as well. So as always, I like to add local color, for example, the skin tone, and for example, the color of this like band on the character's hair. I want to add that using a soft light layer and then just paint over it with the relevant color. If we want to change that, we can simply select the layer of this color and then adjust the color, right? Or adjust the saturation. So this is a really organized way to do things. And because this piece is quite simple, right? There really isn't too much local color to worry about. We basically have to worry about the skin tone and like this extra band over here. Because quite obviously, right, we have like a monochromatic clothing for the character as well. So fortunately for us, this part is quite simple. And of course, we can also remember to like draw the filter on the cigarette here, which might be a slightly different color, but this is really a small part. You can paint it in manually later as well. So in this situation, I didn't really care about that. So the next step is, now that our local colors are done, in this case, it was really quick, we can start thinking about the lighting color. I'll begin with the side light. So the side light, I actually wanted it to be a deep red, because the idea is that red is usually a really good color to use as an accent color in a situation where you don't want it to be too strong, because red is almost like a dark light in a sense, because red is something that we don't see too well, I believe. So it tends to not appear really bright. So it serves quite well in contrast to, for example, this really strong light from the left side. So in this case, I use a bit of red and then colored over the area where I designated my soft light, my side light is. Right, so I basically color all the corresponding areas with like a orange overlay layer. Right, in this case, I use the overlay layer and then I just painted orange over these relevant areas. So quite straightforward as well. Next, we can start working on the other light. No, excuse me, the backlight, right? The backlight all the way from here. Right, we can start working on the backlight and introduce color to it as well. So in this situation, the option is quite simple. I just wanted like a contrast in color. So obviously blue contrasts really well with this reddish orange. And so that is what I use for the color here. So again, simply use overlay layer, paint over the relevant areas, right? The fingers here as well. And a bit of area here near the creases of the waist and a bit on the arms of the character's suit. And then once that is done, we can add in the relevant background color as well. So this part is quite simple. We simply look at the drawing and say, okay, our dominating light in a sense is this blue light here, right? The whole, for example, wider world out there is in like perhaps at night. So we're gonna have this dark blue for the night as well. And then that is why we have the overall like mood sort of ambient color be this sort of blue, right? Whereas the red stays in like a more localized accent color. So this is sort of me explaining why I picked the choice. And because we have this sort of ambient color, we can also think about our top light, right? Remember our weak top light? This is where it comes in as well. I added a bit of blue to that area. As you can see, once we have sort of the basic structure, I'm more comfortable to go a bit freeform, but the concept and the sort of flow remains the same. We want to assign colors to each of the light sources and then make sure the color as a whole conforms to the overall scene ambient color as well. So this is this stage, right, where we have almost all our values and colors in the right place. And then here's is something that we can try as well. So I decided, okay, so I want the top to be, or rather the area that is high up to be a bit brighter. So added in a gradient. This is completely optional. It depends on your personal taste as well, but this is just me explaining what happened here. And then the next part here is slightly more complex. So from so far, we've talked about some really, really simple and straightforward mechanical stuff that we can break down really easily, right? And it has served us quite well because it's allowed us to get to a point where we basically have most of the piece, on lockdown. We know all our local values, we know all our local colors, we know where and how each of our lights will hit the character, we know what color all of those lights are respectively. Right, so we've come really far, but the next step is where things get slightly more difficult and slightly more requiring of how do I put it, fundamental knowledge, and perhaps some references will also be really helpful here. And this is because we are adding some shadows and occlusion shadows as well. So what this mainly means is that we need to look at the structures on a character and then start breaking them down into finer details, right? Because we know that a suit isn't just like consists of two surfaces, one surface that receives light from top and one doesn't. There are, of course, right, nuances in the folds and the creases of a suit, really just anything in the scene as well. So for example, here I decided, okay, I need to add a bit of darker red to the area of the character's cheek that is facing up, because the hair might be covering up some of the otherwise, weak top light that, for example, the shoulders are receiving. So this is basically this part of the process where I start adding in this occluding shadows and then start figuring out how the piece should basically be drawn at like a quote unquote higher resolution, right? Because this is a really simple, or in like 3D terms, it's like a really low poly setup. But here is where we have to go a bit more high poly because, right, eventually we have to start proceeding to doing the illustration itself. And the next is once we have like a basic sort of low mid poly almost setup, right, where we account for the detail in like a reasonable way, we have to start like really going into detail on how each and every area is accounted for. For example, like going through the gradients here, making sure each area has its correct sort of response to the light. So we'll notice here, right? For example, the orange was really even. The orange on the hair is pretty much equal to the orange on this part of the character's shirt, which is not good, right? Because we know the shirt is white and it's really reflective of any light that comes to it. So in this situation, I wanted to start, right, making adjustments to relevant areas, like for example, making this area that reflects the side light really bright, right? This area is really bright. Same with this area. So these are some of the considerations that I'm making as the piece proceeds. At this stage, I'm painting a bit more organically. I'm less concerned with doing things too step by step. But this is still, right, the general concept that we're going for, going into more and more detail. And basically in 3D terms, right, being more high poly in our way of thinking of the piece. So for the purpose of this tutorial, we've really covered sort of the meat, right, which is the breakdown of how to add the light, how to plan the light, how to edit, and then how to start transitioning from there into a more finished piece. So from here on, I will be skipping a few steps for the purpose of this tutorial, and then we are going to jump to the next step, which is almost near the end, right? But as you can see here, the important thing is that overall sort of composition remains almost identical. Everything remains pretty much the same, right? Of course, there are substantial changes in like the sort of, how do I put it, the completion level and the detail level of the piece, but really that is just a matter of time and spending time just rendering the details over and over again until you get where you want. So yeah, this is the final part already, the final transition to the next step. And I like to think of it as a step where I really go in and start removing all these lines. Remember our earliest line sketch, right? It's been accompanying us until right this point in time. So personally, my style is to remove them. And so this is what I do in the final step, right? Paint over them, assign the relevant light to it, assign the relevant lighting, and the relevant texture, right? How sharp an edge should be, and all that good stuff. So once that is done, we can add a bit more special effects, for example, like the smoke here, as well as some rough brushes to represent bloodstains, just to make like the scene a bit more interesting. So yeah, this is a quick and simple breakdown of the process to create this particular drawing on this particular character from the line sketch. So to go over the whole process a bit more simply, no worries, because all these images here are provided as well. We basically begin with a simple line sketch to show off or to present to ourselves, in a sense, our design, to make sure everything lines up. And then we add in the base values, account for each of our lighting setups separately, combine them, make an adjustment to get closer to our final values. And then we add in some local colors to basically start filling them in. And then we add in some lighting color, right? Adjust the background color here, which is quite relevant in our situation because we don't really have a specific like background. So we just want to match the same sort of color and ambience of like our main light here, which is sort of this dark blue. Add a bit of gradient, right, which is again optional. And then basically from here on out, it's just drawing everything following, right, really following our lighting plan, but in more detail. And yeah, that is it for the process of creating this piece. I hope you have found the process breakdown useful, and because of time constraints, I wasn't able to explain everything in depth, but now is a chance for everyone to ask their questions, and I'll answer as many of them as I can. So let us begin.